The gravel road, overgrown and barely visible beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, had clawed at the underside of my borrowed sedan for the last hour. Each shudder and groan of the vehicle was a testament to the estate's defiant isolation, a geographical assertion of its desire to remain forgotten. I, Reid, had always found solace and precision in the clean lines of a meticulously rendered border, the elegant sweep of a contour line. My life, until this inheritance, had been a canvas of known quantities, charted and verified. This, however, was a blank space on any map I had ever drawn. The manor house, when it finally loomed into view through a veil of weeping willow branches, was less a structure and more a geological event. Stone turrets, once proud, now sagged under the weight of centuries. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from beneath heavy brows of ivy, their panes fractured or entirely absent. A chill, damp and earthy, seeped into my bones the moment I stepped from the car. The air here was not merely still, it was stagnant, holding its breath. My great-aunt, the last occupant, had been a recluse even by family legend, her existence a faint rumor whispered during hushed holiday gatherings. Now, her final act had pulled me, the last living relative, into this decaying embrace. The solicitor, a man whose tailored suit seemed impossibly crisp against the manor's backdrop, had passed over the heavy iron key with a sigh that spoke volumes of his own unease. "Everything is as she left it," he'd murmured, avoiding my gaze. Untouched 4. Inside, the silence was absolute, a heavy blanket woven from dust and decay. My footsteps echoed, each crunch on the fallen plaster and splintered wood amplified into a jarring intrusion. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to ordering chaos, immediately sought a grid, a system, but found only disarray. Sheets draped like shrouds over furniture of indeterminate age, lending the grand hall the appearance of a ghostly tableau. I moved through the house with a methodical slowness, my hand tracing the patterns of peeling wallpaper, my breath misting in the frigid air. The sheer scale of the neglect was staggering. Every surface was filmed with a fine, gray powder, every corner thick with cobwebs that shimmered like forgotten lace. The air was a complex perfume of dry rot, forgotten potpourri, and something else, something metallic and faintly saline, like old blood. I found myself drawn to a wing of the house that seemed older, its timbers groaning with a deeper, more ancient sorrow. It felt like a school hallway during summer with wrong decorations. Faded paper streamers, bleached by some long-forgotten light, hung limply from the ceiling, their cheerful colors muted to a sickly pastel. Small, brittle cutouts of grinning suns and lopsided paper flowers were still tacked to the peeling paint, remnants of a celebration that felt utterly out of place in this mausoleum of a home. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten things, held a peculiar stillness, as if even the dust motes were too afraid to dance. A faint, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left too long, clung to the air here, a jarring counterpoint to the sterile, forgotten cheer. This strange passage led me to a library, or what had once been one. Bookshelves, heavy with their silent cargo, lined the walls, their spines crumbling. In the center of the room stood a vast, oak desk, its surface buried under a mountain of papers, ledgers, and what appeared to be ancient instruments. This was where the heirlooms must reside. My hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I began to clear a space. And then, there it was. Not a document, nor a piece of jewelry, but a scroll, rolled tightly and tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. Its parchment, thick and yellowed, felt like dried skin beneath my fingertips. I untied the ribbon with care, unrolling the scroll across the cleared desk space. It was a map. My breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary family keepsake. This was a cartographer's dream, and perhaps his nightmare. The hand that had drawn it was masterful, meticulous, almost obsessive in its detail. Every rise and fall of the estate's land, every gnarled tree, every winding stream was rendered with exquisite accuracy. I could see the familiar contours of the land I had just traversed, the exact location of the manor, the forgotten outbuildings. But then, the anomalies began. My fingers traced the lines, and a growing unease prickled at the back of my neck. The map was incomplete. It simply ceased at the estate's southern boundary, a jagged, unnatural tear in the parchment, as if the land itself refused to be fully contained. And within its detailed confines, beyond the familiar, were features I did not recognize. A labyrinthine network of lines, not roads or paths, but something deeper, almost subterranean, spiraling beneath the manor itself. There were symbols, too, small, intricate glyphs clustered around these hidden pathways, stark against the faded ink. They resembled no cartographic notation I had ever encountered. They looked less like labels and more like warnings, or perhaps, incantations. This map was a puzzle, a challenge to my very craft. It presented a landscape both known and utterly alien, a meticulously drawn lie, or perhaps, a terrible truth half-revealed. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the strange, unlabeled features. I had to complete this map. The silence inside was a living thing, pressing against my eardrums, each breath a loud, lonely exhalation. My footsteps, heavy with the weight of generations, crunched on fallen plaster and splintered wood, each sound amplified into a jarring intrusion. The air, thick with the scent of dust and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten things, clung to my clothes. I had spent the morning in the main hall, poring over the map. It was old, impossibly old, its parchment the color of dried blood, brittle at the edges. Its lines, drawn with a meticulous hand, depicted the estate not as it appeared on any modern deed, but as a sprawling, complex organism. The house itself was merely the heart, from which veins and arteries of paths and forgotten structures branched into the surrounding wild. My fingers, stained with the map's ancient dust, traced a series of notations I couldn't decipher, symbols that looked less like conventional cartography and more like a private, arcane script. A determined frown creased my brow. This was a challenge, a puzzle of geography and history. Stepping out into the oppressive stillness of the afternoon, the map clutched in my hand, I felt the sun, weak and watery, filter through the dense canopy of ancient oaks. The estate grounds were a testament to neglect, a tangle of overgrown brambles and skeletal rose bushes clawing at the crumbling stone walls. I began my exploration at the property's western edge, where a faint, almost invisible track, swallowed by decades of unchecked growth, snaked away from the main house. The map showed a small, octagonal structure here, labeled simply, the Watcher's Folly. There was no record of such a building in any official document I had unearthed. It was fleeting, like a ghost's sigh, but distinct. My breath plumed for a moment, a tiny, white cloud against the muted greens of the undergrowth. Further in, where the map indicated a boundary marker, I found not a survey stone, but a cluster of rough-hewn pillars, each taller than myself, arranged in a crude circle. These markers were not aligned with any known astronomical or geological feature. They simply were, a mute declaration of something ancient and intentional, yet utterly devoid of purpose I could discern. My cartographer's instinct screamed anomaly. A faint, rhythmic creaking, like the slow swing of a forgotten gate, drifted on the barely there breeze. It seemed to emanate from deeper within the woods, a sound both mechanical and organic. I consulted the map, my thumb running over a dotted line that vanished into a particularly dense thicket. The annex, it read, its script oddly precise, almost modern, compared to the rest of the notations. The undergrowth grew denser, the trees closing in like conspirators. Before me stood a low, rectangular building, its windows boarded over, its slate roof sagging like a weary back. It was clearly an older structure, perhaps a servant's quarters or an old schoolhouse, but it was nowhere on the modern blueprints. A single, heavy wooden door, warped and gray, stood ajar, exhaling the same musty breath I had encountered in the main house. The creaking sound, I realized, was coming from within. I stepped over the threshold, into a space that arrested me completely. My mind, accustomed to the logical progression of historical timelines, stumbled. Sunlight, thin and jaundiced, filtered through grimy, high-set windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stale air. On the walls, tacked unevenly, were decorations. Not the cheerful drawings of children's art projects one might expect, nor the faded remnants of seasonal festivities. These were crude, unsettling cutouts of what appeared to be human figures, their faces blank, their limbs stiffly posed, some holding hands, others standing alone. They were made from yellowed construction paper, their edges curling, their colors muted to a sickly ochre in sepia. And amongst them, interspersed with disquieting randomness, were garlands of dried, blackened flowers, their petals shriveled and brittle, strung together with coarse twine. The summer heat, or what little of it penetrated this forgotten place, seemed to amplify their decay, their faint, cloying scent of rot clinging to the air. Each of the figures, I noticed, was missing a vital part, an eye, a hand, a foot, cut away with deliberate precision. And the wrongness of the decorations was not just their decay, but their subject matter. One showed a figure with an exaggerated, open mouth, from which a single, painted tear descended. The creaking sound was louder here, a steady, mournful rhythm. My breath hitched. This place, this forgotten annex, felt wrong. The map, clutched tight in my hand, suddenly felt less like a guide and more like a prophecy. This estate was not merely old, it was ancient, burdened by secrets that clawed at the edges of my perception, demanding to be unearthed. And I, the cartographer, was now caught in its unsettling embrace. My footsteps, heavy with the dust of generations, echoed through the cavernous hall, each sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The air itself seemed thick, tasting of old stone and something else, a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I told myself it was rust, the decay of forgotten ironwork, but a colder part of me knew it was something deeper, something less explicable. Days bled into a blurred succession of sifting through mildewed documents and tracing the rough lines of the incomplete map, its parchment brittle beneath my careful touch. I worked late into the nights, the glow of my desk lamp a fragile island against the encroaching gloom. It was then, in the deep hours, that the periphery of my vision began to betray me. A trick of the eye, I'd murmur, the play of lamplight on dust motes, or perhaps just the fatigue of long hours. My brain, I reasoned, was simply seeking patterns in the random. But the subtle shifts grew bolder. A tremor, barely perceptible, would run through the floorboards beneath my feet, a low thrumming like a distant, forgotten heart. They were not words, not precisely, but a soft, sibilant rustling, like dry leaves skittering across flagstones or the hushed murmur of a crowd standing just outside a closed door. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, weaving themselves into the fabric of the old house. It was the wind, I argued, whistling through unseen cracks, or the settling of ancient timbers. A house this old, I told myself, was bound to have its own voice. My tools, meticulously arranged at the start of each session, would sometimes be subtly displaced. A ruler, laid perfectly parallel to the map's edge, would lie askew, as if brushed by an invisible hand. I attributed it to my own absent-mindedness, the inevitable disarray of intense focus. Sleep offered no true respite. My nights became a succession of vivid, unsettling nightmares, each more disorienting than the last. The lockers, usually a bright, uniform blue, were painted in clashing, sickly greens and oranges, peeling like diseased skin. Children's drawings, tacked haphazardly to corkboards, depicted not smiling suns or stick figures, but gnarled trees with roots like grasping fingers, and vacant-eyed faces staring out from smudged paper. The air was thick with the scent of stale chalk and something metallic, like the tang I'd noticed in the house. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, malevolent drone, flickering intermittently, plunging sections of the corridor into an inky blackness that seemed to pulse. I woke with a gasp, the metallic tang still sharp in my nostrils, the phantom hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing behind my eyes. In the pale pre-dawn light, I leaned over the ancient parchment, my heart thrumming an uneven rhythm against my ribs. I traced a familiar contour, a line I had memorized, a known boundary of the estate. But as my finger moved, I froze. It was a symbol, not a geometric shape, but a crude, jagged mark, like a broken star or a splintered eye. It had not been there yesterday. I was certain. My cartographers, I was trained for such minute details, for the subtle shifts in ink and age. I ran my thumb over the mark, feeling the faint raised texture of the old paper. It was new. The logical mind, my loyal companion, tried to offer explanations, a trick of the light, a previously overlooked imperfection, a hallucination born of exhaustion. The house was not merely settling, it was waking. The oppressive quiet of the estate, once a mere absence of sound, had begun to feel like a presence, a watchful entity holding its breath. Yet, within that chaos, the map pulsed with an insistent, unsettling logic. It called to me, a silent oracle demanding interpretation, and I, a man of lines and legends, could not refuse its summons. Days blurred into a single, dust-laden quest. I moved through the ancestral library, a mausoleum of forgotten thoughts, my hands brushing against spines brittle with age. The air hung heavy with the scent of decaying paper and the metallic tang of old ink. Here, beneath layers of forgotten histories and trivial accounts, I began my excavation. The first fragments emerged from a leather-bound diary, its script faded to a ghost of itself. It belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Ilara, from the late 18th century. Several of Ilara's vague descriptions, a weeping stone, a place where the roots drink deep, seemed to correspond with the map's most enigmatic markings. Further digging unearthed a cache of letters, tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. These were between a male ancestor, a land agent named Silas, and a distant relative in the capital, dating from the mid-19th century. Silas's early letters were filled with practicalities, but as the years progressed, a frantic undertone emerged. "The disappearances continue," he scribbled, his hand trembling even on the page. "The local folk speak of the old ways, of a hunger in the soil that demands appeasement." He mentioned specific dates, cyclical patterns, and locations that, once more, mirrored the obscure points on my map. The weight of these revelations pressed upon me. I needed more, something external to the estate's insular, decaying narrative. My search led me to the small town's historical society, housed in what was once the primary school. Inside, the atmosphere was a jarring symphony of wrongness. Garlands of faded autumn leaves, brittle and brown, drooped from the ceiling, mingling incongruously with tinsel-thin strings of what looked like skeletal paper bats. On the bulletin boards, beside yellowed notices for long-past bake sales, hung crude, childlike drawings. An elderly archivist, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose and a shawl draped over her shoulders to spite the summer heat, looked up as I entered the small, cluttered research room. Her eyes, though kind, held a deep, knowing weariness. I explained my research, carefully omitting the map's more unsettling details. He listened, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window, as if seeing something beyond the manicured lawn. "Ah, the Reid family," he said, his voice a soft rasp. "Always a strange air about that estate. The old folk, they had stories of bad seasons, when the earth itself seemed to claim its due. When the children, or sometimes the young men, and that the family, well, they were always tied to it, for good or ill." Her words resonated with the frantic scrawls in Silas's letters, the growing madness in Ilara's journal. The map, once a mere cartographic challenge, had transformed in my mind. It was no longer a guide to hidden features, but a key for something malevolent. Each line, each contour, each obscure symbol now felt less like a topographical notation and more like an instruction, a ritualistic diagram. I was connecting the dots, not of a historical puzzle, but of a horrifying pattern. The estate wasn't just decaying, it was alive, and it was hungry. The weight of the map pressed against my mind, heavier than any parchment and ink could justify. Her words, a key for something malevolent, had taken root, twisting the meticulous lines and symbols into a new, sinister language. I had sought to complete, to understand. Now, I felt I was merely opening a door I should have left sealed. The estate, once merely old, now felt ancient, burdened by a history that hummed beneath the floorboards and rustled in the dying leaves outside. My determination, however, remained a stubborn ember, refusing to be extinguished entirely by the creeping dread. I had to know. I had to complete the map, if only to understand the full scope of what I was facing. This was not just a cartographic challenge, it was a confrontation. I spent the next few days in a fog of sleepless vigilance, the estate's silence no longer a bomb but a canvas for subtle disturbances. The floorboards groaned with a weight that was not my own, the wind chimes on the porch sang a tuneless dirge even on still nights, and a scent, like damp earth mixed with something metallic and acrid, clung to the air in certain rooms. It was fleeting, just at the edge of perception, but enough to set my teeth on edge. They no longer merely skittered at the periphery of my hearing like dry leaves across stone. Now, they coalesced, fragments of sound forming into a guttural hum, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The familiar contours of the study, the leather-bound books, the heavy oak desk, the patterned rug wavered, then dissolved. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sickly yellow glow on lockers painted with peeling, cartoonish snowflakes and tinsel that hung limp and dusty from the ceiling. A giant, crudely drawn jack-o'-lantern grinned from a bulletin board adorned with faded Valentine's hearts. The silence was absolute, a profound void that pressed in on my eardrums. I was utterly alone, the only sound the frantic thrumming in my own head. My breath hitched, a choked gasp caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate plea for reality. The physical manifestations followed, no longer ignorable. A heavy atlas, previously secured on a high shelf, crashed to the floor with a deafening thud as I passed through the hall. A porcelain pitcher, a family heirloom, shattered on the kitchen tiles while I was in the next room, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I found the ornate silver locket, passed down through generations, lying open on my pillow, though I had left it secured in a locked drawer downstairs. Inside, instead of the miniature portrait of my great-grandmother, was a crudely drawn, unsettling symbol I recognized from the periphery of the map, a jagged, star-like form with a gaping maw at its center. It was a clear, undeniable message. Overwhelmed, I snatched my phone, my fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar weight of it in my trembling hand. I needed to speak to someone, anyone. I tried the detective first, the one who had handled the estate transfer. His voice was cordial, but laced with a barely concealed impatience. "Mr. Reid, I assure you, old houses make noises. And stress can play tricks on the mind. Perhaps a change of scenery? A short trip away?" He suggested it with the air of a man humoring a child. I tried to explain the locket, the symbol, the school hallway, but my words tumbled out, disjointed and frantic, sounding even to my own ears like the ravings of a madman. He politely cut me off, promising to look into it if anything tangible occurred. Next, I called a colleague, a fellow cartographer, hoping for a more sympathetic ear. "Reid? You sound utterly exhausted," he said, his voice crackling through the poor reception. "Too much solitude and too many old maps, eh? Happens to the best of us. Take a break. Come back to the city." He laughed, a light, dismissive sound that drove a spike of isolation through my chest. He heard my words, but he didn't hear them. He heard only a tired man in an old house. They didn't believe me. No one would. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this decaying labyrinth, the entity's presence now a tangible force pressing in on me from all sides. My eyes were drawn to the jagged symbol, now etched into my memory from the locket. It was subtly repeated throughout the most ancient sections of the map, almost hidden within the topography of the land itself. I ran my finger over a specific point, a small, almost imperceptible depression marked near the oldest oak on the property, a point where several subterranean passages converged. A life for the awakening. The key. The sacrifice. It was all there, laid bare before me, not as a metaphor, but as a terrible, concrete demand. The map was not just a guide, it was a ritual blueprint, and I, Reid, the last living cartographer of this cursed lineage, was not merely its interpreter, but its intended instrument. The air in my study, usually a quiet accomplice to my meticulous work, now felt thick with an unspoken accusation. The map lay spread before me, its aged parchment a brittle tapestry of lines and symbols that had, until now, stubbornly resisted my full understanding. Each contour, each faded inscription, had been a puzzle piece, but the previous night's chilling revelation, the key, the sacrifice, had twisted the entire image into something monstrous. I had spent the twilight hours before dawn poring over the family's oldest journals, cross-referencing the cryptic phrases with the map's obscure iconography. The script was a dense thicket of archaic flourishes, barely legible, speaking of the deep slumber and the binding threads. My eyes burned, but a frantic energy propelled me forward. I wasn't just charting land anymore, I was decoding a terrible will, a legacy of dread. A particular passage, almost indecipherable, spoke of the slumbering heart and the ancient earth's burden. This image, when overlaid with the map's concentric circles, clicked into place with a sickening finality. The circles weren't just geographical markers, they were a schematic, a diagram of containment. Just as this understanding began to coalesce, a sudden, blinding flash erupted behind my eyes, not of light, but of pure, disorienting presence. The study, the map, the scent of old paper, all dissolved. I was standing, no, floating, in a long, empty space. The walls, painted a faded institutional beige, were adorned not with cheerful seasonal art, but with decaying garlands of dried, black leaves and shriveled, crimson berries, like offerings left to rot. From the ceiling hung streamers made of what looked like desiccated skin, curling and brittle, twisting gently in an unseen draft. Classroom doors, each with a small, grimy window, lined both sides of the hall. This was not a memory, not a dream. This was an intrusion, a deliberate projection into the fragile architecture of my mind. A low, guttural vibration hummed through the floor beneath my bare feet. It wasn't sound, but a resonance, a deep tremor that spoke of immense, subterranean power. The wrong decorations seemed to shiver. The shriveled leaves rustled without wind. Then, from the very end of the hallway, where the beige walls met in an impossible, vanishing point, a voice, not of sound, but of pure, crushing thought, seeped into me. The lineage calls. The keeper returns to the prison. The images in the hallway twisted further. The dried leaves on the walls began to writhe, not with life, but with a mimicry of agony. The message was unmistakable, horrifyingly clear. The map in my study was not a guide to a hidden treasure, nor even a simple record of the estate's boundaries. It was a blueprint for a seal, a complex cage of earth and forgotten ritual, designed to hold something vast and terrible captive beneath my inherited land. And that seal was failing. The hallway began to fragment, the wrong decorations dissolving into a kaleidoscope of screaming colors and textures. You, the last cartographer, the last of the bloodline. You are the instrument of its containment. Or its release. I gasped, my eyes snapping open to the familiar, if now terrifying, reality of my study. The scent of old paper, the cool touch of the parchment beneath my fingers, were real again. But the metallic tang, the cloying ancientness, lingered in my nostrils. The map, still spread before me, now held a new, grotesque clarity. The concentric circles, the obscure symbols, the undisturbed earth I had so innocently marked, it all pointed to a singular, horrifying truth. Beneath the land I had inherited, beneath the very foundations of my ancestral home, lay not a treasure, but a prison. An ancient entity, not of this world, yet deeply rooted within it, was stirring. Its containment, a fragile balance maintained by my predecessors, was failing. And I, Reid, the meticulous cartographer, the last of my line, had been drawn here, not by chance, but by a terrible, generational imperative. I was the keeper, or perhaps, the unwitting jailer. The choice, if there was one, was now mine. The metallic tang, that ancient, cloying sweetness, still clung to the membranes of my nose, a phantom echo of the dream. My study, once a sanctuary of ordered chaos, now felt like a stage set for something unspeakable. The air, usually still and heavy with the scent of aged paper and leather, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, a low thrum that vibrated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. I pushed back from the desk, the scrape of the chair loud in the unnatural quiet. My fingers, still stained with the sepia ink of the incomplete map, felt alien, clumsy. The intricate lines, the careful notations, they now seemed to writhe, like tiny, trapped worms beneath my gaze. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the lingering fog of the nightmare, but the edges of my vision shimmered, blurring the familiar bookshelves into wavering specters. It wants something. The thought wasn't mine, yet it bloomed fully formed in the center of my mind, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It wasn't just in the room, it was within the very fabric of the house, a vast, patient hunger stirring from its long slumber. I stood, my legs unsteady, and took a step towards the window, seeking the anchor of the waning afternoon light. But the world outside the pane was not the familiar tangle of overgrown gardens. Instead, for a horrifying blink, I was no longer in my study. The lockers, painted a peeling institutional green, stretched into a vanishing point, but instead of children's drawings or notices, they were adorned with intricate, fleshy carvings, symbols that pulsed with a faint, internal light, mirroring the cryptic designs on my own map. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that resonated with the stone in my chest. Then, as quickly as it had manifested, the hallucination dissolved, leaving me swaying, gripping the edge of my desk, the glass of the window cool and solid beneath my palm. The entity had shown itself. Not as a form, but as a twisting of reality, a violation of my very perception. It was a direct, undeniable communication. It is here. It is real. A desperate resolve hardened within me. I needed to understand. I needed a weapon, a defense. There had to be something more. I remembered the odd, almost invisible seam in the underside of the heavy oak desk, a detail I'd noted but dismissed as a joiner's imperfection. Now, driven by a frantic urgency, I knelt, my fingers tracing the line. It wasn't a flaw. It was a hidden drawer, expertly disguised. With a grunt of effort, I managed to unlatch a small, almost imperceptible catch. It was a ledger, meticulous as my own cartographic notes, but filled not with measurements, but with a cramped, spidery script and crude, unsettling illustrations. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. The script detailed a series of rituals, a desperate attempt by an ancestor, a previous guardian of the estate, to contain the very force I had disturbed. There were references to the land, to the veins beneath the soil, and to a great hunger that consumed. The illustrations depicted stylized figures, almost skeletal, performing acts of severe, symbolic sacrifice before crude altars. Then, I found it. The countermeasure. It wasn't a simple reburial. It was a resealing, a binding, a ritual to force the entity back into its slumber, to mend the rent in the land it had exploited. But the price. A severing of the self. A relinquishing of the guiding hand. I, Reid, the cartographer, whose life was defined by lines, by boundaries, by the meticulous charting of the known world. It meant more than just a physical act. It meant sacrificing the very essence of what made me me. My ability to perceive order, to create maps, to understand the world through defined edges. It meant potentially losing my mind, my purpose, my connection to the land in the very way I sought to preserve it. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a profound, irreversible alteration of my being, a fragment of my soul offered to re-establish the ancient seals. The fate of the land, this very estate, and perhaps the boundaries between what I knew and what lay beyond, rested on my ability to make this ultimate, terrifying choice. The cold stone in my chest solidified into a block of ice, and the air grew heavy, pressing down, demanding an answer. The hum deepened, vibrating through the very floorboards beneath my feet, a silent, ancient question echoing through the house, through my own marrow, will you pay the price? I, Reid, stood at the precipice of the known, the meticulously charted lines of my life now dissolved into a swirling void. The map, my salvation and my torment, lay clutched in a hand that trembled not with fear, but with the terrifying resolve of a man utterly broken and utterly reborn. The sacrifice of self, the severing of the guiding hand, it was not merely an idea now, but a visceral tearing, a raw wound in the fabric of my being. My purpose, once to define boundaries, was now to obliterate them, to descend into the unmapped depths. A cold, damp breath sighed from the gaping maw beneath the old hearth, the passage I had finally unearthed. It was not a cellar, nor a crypt as I understood them. This was a wound in the earth, a descent into something far older than the estate itself, a place the map had only hinted at with a series of cryptic, spiraling symbols. The air tasted of whetstone and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like ancient, dried blood. I lit the lantern, its flame a solitary, defiant heartbeat against the encroaching gloom. The first steps were into an earthen tunnel, shored up by rough-hewn timbers that groaned under the weight of the forgotten world above. Each drop seemed to carry a faint, acrid odor, stinging my nostrils. Then, the first assault. The rough earth beneath my boots dissolved, replaced by a smooth, linoleum floor. I was in a school hallway during summer. With wrong decorations. Lockers, painted a faded institutional green, lined one side, their vents breathing a stale, metallic tang. On the other, a series of closed classroom doors, each adorned with withered, blood-red streamers that looked less like festive adornments and more like strips of dried flesh. Children's drawings, tacked haphazardly, depicted stick figures with wide, black eyes and exaggerated, screaming mouths, their vibrant crayon colors faded to unsettling pastels. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind, a cartographer's mind, demanded order, demanded logic. This surreal tableau was a deliberate violation of both. Reid. Turn back. The lines will break you. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into them, forcing the image away. The hum of the lights, the sickly yellow glow, they clung to the inside of my eyelids. I opened them again, and the illusion wavered, like heat haze over asphalt. The lockers rippled, the streamers writhed, and then, with a sickening lurch, the stone walls of the tunnel solidified around me once more. The damp, earthy smell returned, chasing away the metallic tang. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but I pressed on. This was its territory, its game. I had to remember that. Strange growths began to appear on the walls, not moss or fungi, but something else entirely. They were pale, translucent things, like clusters of blind, fleshy eyes, throbbing faintly with a barely perceptible light. I recoiled, my skin crawling. You abandon your craft, Reid. You defile the truth. Then my own reflection, warped and monstrous, stared back from a slick patch of stone, its mouth opening to reveal not teeth, but a swirling vortex of blackness. This is your truth now, Reid. Unmaking. The floor beneath me became uneven, treacherous. Loose scree shifted, threatening to send me plummeting into the unseen depths. I had come too far. I had sacrificed too much. This path, however twisted, however horrifying, was the only one left. The passage finally opened into a vast, echoing chamber. The air here was still, utterly devoid of natural currents, yet it pressed in on me with a palpable weight. My lantern light struggled against the immensity, revealing only glimpses of colossal, roughly carved pillars that rose into an unseen ceiling. And everywhere, etched into the earthen surfaces, were symbols. Then I saw it. At the center of the chamber, beneath a yawning fissure in the ceiling from which a faint, putrid light seemed to emanate, stood an altar. It was a single, massive block of unpolished black stone, its surface stained with what could only be the residue of countless, forgotten rituals. Not mine, but one of the estate's older heirlooms, its brass tarnished, its needle spinning wildly, frantically, as if trying to point to every direction at once, or perhaps to no direction at all. This was the locus. This was where the lines converged. And this was where I would make my final, terrible offering. Each step was a battle, not just against the physical terrain, but against the insidious whispers that clawed at the edges of my perception. The ground dissolved into a slick, sloping plane, and I slid, momentum carrying me forward into an abyss that was not truly dark, but rather a void where light simply ceased to exist. I lay sprawled on a floor that felt solid beneath my palms, yet utterly alien. The walls, painted a faded institutional green, were lined with lockers, their chipped paint revealing layers of neglect. But instead of vibrant student artwork or school pride banners, there were skeletal anatomical charts, yellowed with age, depicting organs in gruesome detail, tacked haphazardly next to faded construction paper cutouts of smiling suns and crude, childlike drawings of figures with too many limbs and vacant eyes. A display case, its glass cracked and clouded, held not trophies or student projects, but a collection of rusted surgical instruments, a dried, pressed flower that looked suspiciously like a human ear, and a single petrified bird's nest filled with tiny, bleached bones. The floor, linoleum peeling in places, was littered with fallen leaves and dust motes dancing in the lantern's beam, yet the windows, though grimy, showed no sign of an outside world, only an impenetrable, gray nothingness. This was no mere hallucination, this was a deliberate perversion, a mockery. The entity was here, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed in on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, a symphony of ancient malice. It was a sound that promised to unravel me, thread by meticulous thread. You found me. And now, you belong. My breath hitched. My hands trembled, but I forced them steady. I had foreseen this. The map, my beautiful, terrible map, had shown me not just the physical contours of the estate, but the energetic conduits, the points of spiritual convergence, the very weaknesses of this ancient, hungry thing. It had revealed the geometry of its imprisonment, the ritual that had bound it, and the counter-ritual that could, perhaps, bind it again. From my satchel, I pulled out the last remaining tools, a small, tarnished silver compass, its needle spinning erratically in this distorted space, a vial of consecrated earth I had painstakingly gathered from the estate's oldest oak. A piece of parchment, brittle with age, bearing the final, cryptic symbols I had painstakingly deciphered. This was it. The culmination of my obsession, my descent. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The anatomical charts on the walls seemed to writhe, the organs pulsing with a faint, sickening light. The crude drawings of multi-limbed figures seemed to stretch their vacant eyes towards me, their paper forms rustling as if stirred by an unseen breath. The entity was reacting, its malevolence coalescing, trying to break my focus, to shatter my resolve. I knelt, ignoring the dust and the scattered, unidentifiable debris on the linoleum. I unrolled the parchment, its symbols glowing faintly in the lantern light, a beacon of order against the chaos. The compass, though erratic, still pointed to a faint, almost imperceptible magnetic anomaly, the heart of the entity's influence, the very spot the map had marked as the fulcrum of its power. You cannot comprehend what you meddle with. I am older than your hills, deeper than your roots. I am the rot in your lineage, the whisper in your blood. I ignored it, or tried to. My hands, though shaking, began to move. Using a piece of chalk I had found in my satchel, a strange comfort, a familiar tool in this alien place, I began to draw. Precise lines, geometric shapes, symbols from the ancient map, tracing them onto the cracked linoleum floor. Each stroke was an act of defiance, an assertion of human will against cosmic indifference. The lines glowed faintly as I drew them, a pale blue luminescence that pulsed with a quiet energy. The hallway began to distort more violently. The lockers seemed to stretch and warp, their metal groaning as if in agony. They spoke of my failures, my arrogance, the madness that had driven me to this point. I gritted my teeth, focusing on the lines, on the ritual. The map had shown me the sequence, the specific order of the symbols, the precise points where the consecrated earth must be placed. This was not a battle of strength, but of precision, of intellect, of order against the entity's chaotic being. As I completed the final symbol, the blue light flared, bathing the hallway in an ethereal glow. I reached for the vial of consecrated earth. The floor beneath me bucked, and the walls seemed to close in, the warped lockers pressing inward, threatening to crush me. The air grew impossibly heavy, a weight that sought to flatten me into the linoleum. My head throbbed, a drumbeat of agony behind my eyes. I felt my grip on sanity fraying, a thin thread stretched to breaking point. But I had come too far. I had sacrificed too much already. With a grunt, I forced myself up, my body screaming in protest, and poured the consecrated earth onto the central convergence point of my drawn ritual circle. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The distorted hallway wavered, then shimmered, like a heat haze over a desert road. The metallic, cloying scent vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of chalk dust. The hum in my bones ceased. I stood, trembling, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. The school hallway was still there, but it was cleaner. Less wrong. The decorations were still out of place, the sun cutouts next to the faded charts, but they no longer pulsed with malevolence. They were merely forgotten, decaying artifacts. The entity was gone. Contained. Banished. But the cost. A vast emptiness stretched where memories should have been. The meticulous details of my life, the precise contours of my past, seemed blurred at the edges, like old maps whose ink had bled. I tried to recall the face of my mother, the warmth of my father's hand, the precise lines of my first, cherished antique map. They were there, somewhere, but distant, like echoes from a dream, not solid, tangible recollections. The entity had not taken my life, nor my sanity entirely. It had taken something more subtle, more insidious. It had taken my precision, my clarity, the very essence of what made me Reid, the cartographer. My mind, once a finely tuned instrument, now felt like a broken compass, forever spinning, forever lost. I had one, yes. But I was no longer whole. I was a map with crucial sections erased, a territory charted but forever incomplete. The triumph tasted like ash in my mouth. The silence was a thick, suffocating shroud, heavy as a winter fog. My skull throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a hollow drumbeat against the vast emptiness where my memories should have been. It was as if a great, hungry beast had scooped out the core of my being, leaving only a fragile shell. I lay on a surface both hard and slick, my body screaming with 1,000 tiny protests. When I forced my eyes open, the light was not the dim, ancient glow of the estate, nor the oppressive darkness of the earth beneath it. Instead, a sickly yellow illumination seeped through high, grimy windows, striping the floor with pale, anemic bars. The air was thick with the scent of old dust, disinfectant, and something else, something cloyingly sweet and faintly metallic, like forgotten blood on cheap linoleum. My head lolled, and I saw a row of lockers, their chipped paint the color of faded denim, stretching into the hazy distance. But it was the decorations that truly snagged the tattered threads of my awareness. Garlands of autumnal leaves, brittle and brown, were strung haphazardly above doorways, despite the summer light filtering in. Crude paper snowflakes, torn at the edges, dangled from the ceiling tiles, swaying imperceptibly in a non-existent breeze. And pinned to a corkboard, amidst faded notices about bake sales and field trips from a bygone era, were strange, unsettling drawings. I tried to push myself up, and a searing pain lanced through my left shoulder. My muscles screamed, knotted, and weak. My nails were broken, ragged, and beneath them, slivers of a material I couldn't identify. This was the event, the physical manifestation of what had transpired. I felt my face, my fingers tracing unfamiliar ridges and valleys. A jagged scar, still tender, ran from my temple, disappearing into the matted strands of my hair. My skin felt stretched, tight, as if I had shed an old skin only to find a coarser, more brittle one beneath. My jaw ached, my teeth felt loose. I was a ruin, a derelict structure of flesh and bone. It seeped into my consciousness like oil into water, staining everything it touched. The entity was gone. This was the reveal. It wasn't a sense of triumph, or even relief. But its departure had not left behind peace. It had left a vacuum, a gaping maw that threatened to consume me whole. I pushed harder, grunting through the pain, and finally managed to prop myself against a cold metal. Lacquer. The metal pressed against my back, a solid, unyielding presence in this shifting, dreamlike reality. My gaze fell upon a particular drawing on the corkboard, a crudely rendered map of a house, but its foundations were impossibly deep, stretching into a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that twisted into an inverted, subterranean tree. And at its very root, a single, black, pulsating circle. My breath hitched. This was no mere hallucination, no simple fever dream. This was an echo, a residue. The entity, though gone from the physical plane, had left its indelible mark, not just on my body, but on the very landscape of my mind. The wrong decorations were not just wrong, they were fragments of its distorted reality, splinters of its influence embedded in my perception. The drawings weren't just drawings, they were the ghost of its presence, still mapping my internal ruins. A profound weariness settled over me, heavier than any physical burden. The cost. The terrible, unquantifiable cost. The silence stretched, vast and indifferent, a testament to the entity's absence, and to my own profound desolation. It was as if a great. I woke to the muted thrum of a city I barely recognized, the estate a distant, echoing dream. The details of the sacrifice, the terrible bargain struck beneath the earth, remained a blur, a collection of visceral sensations more than coherent events. But the result was undeniable. A quiet cessation. A profound stillness where once an ancient hunger had pulsed, and the price? My mind, a fractured landscape, rich with a terrible knowledge, yet barren of the past that had led me there. My youth, my family, the precise trajectory of my life before the estate's shadow fell, all dissolved, leaving only the present and the chilling certainty of what I had become. My determination, once focused on the completion of a map, now sharpened into a different, more terrible purpose: vigilance. I had to live, to move among the unsuspecting, to ensure the stillness held. Days bled into weeks, a quiet blur of motion and stark, unadorned rooms. I sought the mundane, the ordinary, as an anchor. An attempt to re-enter the world, or what was left of my perception of it. One sweltering afternoon, I found myself walking through a school hallway during summer with wrong decorations. The air, thick and still, carried the faint, sweet scent of floor wax and dust. Empty classrooms lined either side, their doors propped open like gaping mouths, revealing stacks of forgotten textbooks and chairs piled high. But what struck me, what grated against the raw nerves of my altered perception, were the decorations. Bright, construction paper snowflakes, faded but still clinging to the bulletin boards, interspersed with skeletal, hand-drawn pumpkins and felt bats. A jarring, unsettling collage of holidays long past, out of sync with the relentless summer heat pressing against the tall windows. The incongruity felt like a physical ache, a mirror to the disjunction within me. My own internal landscape was similarly adorned with misplaced fragments, bright flashes of dread amidst the dull, everyday. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, almost imperceptible frequency, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, a subtle echo of the resonant hum that had preceded its appeasement. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn linoleum, the only sound in the vast, empty corridor. My eyes, once so keen for the minute details of historical topography, now scanned for something else entirely. I ran my fingers along the rough texture of a brick wall, feeling the faint, cool breath that seemed to emanate from between the mortar lines. A colleague, a quiet man with spectacles who had once shared my passion for ancient surveys, called out from an open office door. He was sorting through old records, preparing for the new academic year. "Reid? You're early. Just dropping off those old maps?" I turned, my face, I knew, was a mask of careful neutrality. "Yes," I said, my voice feeling distant, a stranger's utterance. I handed him the rolled parchments, copies of mundane municipal surveys. My hands, once so steady, trembled almost imperceptibly. He didn't notice. He couldn't. "Good to have you back," he said, offering a small, kind smile. "You were gone a while. Everything all right after the estate business?" I nodded, a lie on my lips. "Everything is settled." But it wasn't. The settlement was a new beginning of a different kind. I walked away from him, back down the hallway, past the anachronistic decorations, feeling the subtle, insistent pull. It wasn't towards the estate anymore, not physically. It was a resonance, a low thrumming within me. The entity, whatever it truly was not gone. It was merely quieted. And that quietude, I now understood, was maintained by a constant, internal vigilance. My lost memories were not just a price, they were a shield, a blank slate that prevented its full resurgence, a sacrifice that kept the world safe, for now. I was not merely a survivor. I was its anchor. Its keeper. The horror was contained, yes. But it was contained in me. And it would never truly be over. My life, my new beginning, was an endless, silent vigil, a living monument to the malevolent force I now carried, silently, within my altered self.